I know now that you're the one that I've been searching for. The special one. The chosen one. Miss Ashcroft.
Emily.
In a way. But not the girl you met. So many attempts. So many failures. Such a waste.
What do you mean?
Copies. Crafted to duplicate you. All useless. All scrapped. They each have their own sad story.
To understand the creatures of Resident Evil Requiem, we first have to understand that the horror of this game does not only focus on another villain, another outbreak, or even the nostalgia of seeing Raccoon City destroyed. It begins with something that came before, with an idea very much in line with Umbrella, but also very much in line with Oswell Spencer. The obsession that human beings did not have to remain human. And the thing is, Spencer never saw the T-virus simply as a tool to gain power, create zombies, or produce bioorganic weapons. That, in a way, was only the surface. For him, the virus was a door, a way to force evolution, to break the natural limits of the body, and above all, to control what made a person human, their will, their memory, their behavior, and, above all else, their identity. And this is where Resident Evil Requiem begins to become much darker than it first appears. Because the game does not only bring back the classic horror of the T-virus, it takes it into a more psychological, more twisted, and, in a certain sense, much crueler territory. Just like in the other games, the human body can mutate here. Yes, it can deform, fill with tumors, and become yet another bioorganic weapon. But the difference here is not only in the new mutations the virus can cause, but in the mind. In the possibility that memories can be manipulated, that an identity can be copied, and that a person can be reduced to a mere vessel for another mind. And well, that is quite important because Resident Evil has always been about scientific and corporate arrogance, about conspiracies, betrayals, creatures, and military organizations that believe they can turn life into a weapon. But Requiem takes that idea into a much more intimate place. All of this begins with ARK. Beneath an old orphanage, Spencer had established one of his most secret laboratories, a place that, under the appearance of an institution for abandoned children, actually functioned as an experimentation center. And this once again perfectly summarizes the kind of horror that Resident Evil has given us for years. On the surface, there is an ordinary facade, an apparently normal and discreet institution. But beneath it, not only beneath the facade, but literally beneath it, there is a laboratory where atrocities are committed. But this time, there is a difference. ARK was not simply another secret laboratory, it was a direct extension of Spencer's vision, a place built to study what he considered to be the next step for humanity. And of course, Spencer was not a man interested in saving lives. He was not trying to cure diseases or improve the world. His idea of evolution was always contaminated by power, selection, superiority, and the obsession with deciding who deserved to move forward and who had to be left behind, which is ironic considering his own end. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because of Spencer's vision inside ARK, the test subjects were girls, or at least female clones in an infantile state. But for Spencer and his team, that did not matter. They were not treated as girls, but as disposable objects. They were treated atrociously because to the staff, they were only samples or disposable pieces within their research. And that makes the origin of the orphanage girls in this installment so disturbing because they were created from the very beginning to be part of an experiment that should never have existed. And the thing is, this idea of transferring memory, identity, or consciousness into another body does not come out of nowhere within Resident Evil. In a way, it strongly recalls previous research in the saga, such as the case of Alex Wesker, who sought to survive death by transferring her consciousness into Natalia Korda, or even the darker case of Dr. Cameron, whose infection allowed him to preserve his mind and move between infected bodies. But the difference is that Spencer seemed to be searching for something colder and more systematic. Alex wanted to escape her own body. Cameron ended up becoming almost a viral consciousness. Spencer, on the other hand, wanted to prove whether an identity could be copied, reconstructed, or implanted inside a genetic duplicate. It was not just about surviving, but about turning human memory into a biological process that could be controlled and reproduced on a massive scale. And that is what makes ARK so important, because it was not simply another laboratory for creating bioorganic weapons. It was a place where Spencer attempted not only to preserve his legacy, but to copy it, turning other bodies into vessels for his memory. To achieve this, Spencer used subjects created through recombinant DNA technology, designed as nearly identical experimental bodies from genetic material selected within his research. It is important to note that these were not necessarily clones of Grace, as many believe, because Grace had not even been born yet and was not the center of that more modern theory. Instead, they were early attempts to create compatible biological vessels capable of receiving, preserving, or reproducing Spencer's memory. This was already disturbing enough on its own, but the most unsettling part would come later. These girls were subjected to procedures in which they were administered the T-virus and blood plasma. Their biology was manipulated and surgical interventions were performed on them, all designed to force memory transfer. The idea was for the virus to act as a vehicle, or as a kind of biological bridge between the body, the mind, and identity. But as often happens with Umbrella's experiments, the theory was much simpler and cleaner than the reality. The so-called Series 60 ended up being an absolute failure. The girls subjected to these procedures did not receive the memory Spencer wanted to transfer. They did not become stable vessels for an external consciousness, and above all, they did not become proof of artificial immortality or superior evolution. Instead, they began to develop severe mental alterations, emotional instability, cognitive distortion, irregularities in their behavior, and a level of violence and strength that became increasingly difficult to control. And this is important because it tells us something fundamental about the horror that Requiem is trying to show. Spencer was trying to manipulate something he did not even fully understand. The body could mutate, yes. Umbrella already knew that. Flesh could grow, muscles could strengthen, bones could deform, skin could peel away, and the organism could survive severe damage. But the mind was something else entirely. Human consciousness did not react to the virus the way infected tissue would. It could not be treated as just another cell, because it broke, fragmented, and became corrupted. That is how the subjects of Series 60 ended up becoming something that was no longer completely human, but also not a useful product for them. They were mentally broken girls subjected to injections, surgery, isolation, and procedures designed to erase the boundary between personality and memory. And in a way, this is where one of the saddest ideas in all of Resident Evil Requiem is born. Many of its creatures are not monsters because they chose to be, or because they were born to destroy. They are monsters because someone decided their lives could be used as experiments. The orphanage girls represent exactly that, because in the game, at first glance, they could seem like just another group of unsettling enemies. They look like altered, aggressive girls, with red eyes, dark veins spreading across their faces, and surgical scars on their heads. And the thing is, this design tells their entire story. The marks on their heads suggest that the procedures were highly invasive. Their eyes show the effect of the virus running through their bodies, and the dark veins indicate that the infection was no longer something internal or controlled. They were created in a laboratory, yes, but they were locked away from birth and treated as tools to solve an obsession they could not even understand. And well, that is something Resident Evil Requiem handles quite well, because many of its creatures are frightening, but they are also pitiful. The lore does not present them as simple obstacles placed in the player's path. They are the visible result of Umbrella's rotten legacy. Over time, Spencer tried to improve the process. After the failures of Series 60, a later generation arrived, known as Series 70. This one seemed more stable, and one of its subjects, Khloe, showed signs of improvement after certain adjustments were made to the blood vector. In theory, Khloe represented progress, proof that Spencer might have been getting closer to his goal, a sign that, with enough calibration, memory transfer could perhaps become more stable. But even that supposed progress ended up revealing the same truth and proved that the project had been doomed from the beginning. And so Khloe's story functions as one of the darkest pieces of this stage. She wakes up one night in February of 1990 and discovers that her companions are no longer in the room. But from the hallways, screams, blows, and chaos begin to echo, showing that another experiment has just gone out of control. Khloe leaves her room and discovers a terrifying scene. The girls have attacked the researchers. They had been treated for years as test material, and now they had become a real threat. Khloe tries to survive by hiding and listening as the other subjects search for her. She takes advantage of a distraction to escape and descends into the lower levels of the orphanage. But what she finds there is even worse. She discovers secret chambers, discarded bodies of failed subjects, hidden facilities, and evidence that the project had been operating for a long time, and that the underground levels were full of these remains, with some of them even rising up to attack her. In the end, she manages to reach ARK, but sadly, Khloe does not receive salvation. When she is finally found by a researcher, they do not treat her like a girl who has just survived a massacre. They simply examine her, detect early signs of T-virus toxicity, and classify her as a failure. And so Khloe becomes another victim of the same system. And this is quite important for understanding the tone of Requiem, because the game does not present Spencer's research as an old stage disconnected from the main story. Instead, it presents it as the root, as a great sin that other organizations would later try to copy or exploit. Because after all of this, Spencer was not only working on memory transfer, in secret he was also developing something completely different, something called Elpis. And here is one of the most interesting twists in Requiem, because for much of the story, Victor Gideon and the Connections believe that Elpis is a mind control virus, and they see it as the perfect weapon, a tool capable of dominating entire populations, overcoming the limitations of other biological weapons, and giving whoever possessed it a definitive military advantage. But in reality, Elpis was not that. Elpis was actually a cure, an antiviral capable of neutralizing infections related to the progenitor virus, stabilizing infected tissue, reversing mutations, and restoring neurological damage. In other words, Spencer had created something that could undo part of the damage and horror that he himself and Umbrella had helped unleash upon the world. And that, in a way, makes everything even more tragic, because the Connections were not pursuing the ultimate weapon. In reality, they were pursuing a lie Spencer had left behind, perhaps to protect Elpis, perhaps to hide it, perhaps because he felt regret, or perhaps simply because, even at the end, he was still manipulating everyone from the shadows. It is also worth noting that the Connections already had experience with biological weapons based on the E-type mold. They knew how to manipulate individuals and alter their bodies to generate forms of control through infected organisms. But the mold had one very clear problem. It was not efficient enough for mass infection, since it did not have the same ability as a virus to spread rapidly among large groups of people. That is why, when the organization found traces of Spencer's project inside ARK, they interpreted Elpis as the missing piece. If it really was a mind control virus, then it could solve the problem of scale. It could turn a limited project into a much larger tool of domination. It could give them what the mold had never fully been able to offer. But they were wrong from the beginning, and because the Connections did not understand that, everything they did afterward became a tragedy built on a false interpretation. The search for Grace Ashcroft, the creation of clones, the experiments on Emily and Marie, the financing of Victor Gideon, and the outbreak inside Road Hill Chronic Care Center all came from that confusion. All because they pursued a cure believing it was a weapon. And this is where Grace, Emily, and Marie become fundamental. Because all three are connected by the same project, but they are not the same. In fact, understanding their differences is key to understanding the entire conflict of Resident Evil Requiem. Grace Ashcroft is the real person, the human one, born sometime between 2003 and 2004, and the adopted daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, a young woman who, because of incomplete files, mistaken interpretations, and the connections obsession ends up being seen as the supposed key to unlocking Elpis. But Grace was not one of Spencer's experiments. She was not an artificial creation, and she was not the source of the project or the origin of the clones. Grace was simply a normal person trapped in a conspiracy that others built around her. And that makes her very different from Emily and Marie, because Emily and Marie were not cloned directly from Grace, at least not in the sense of being exact copies of her. They were manufactured following a genetic pattern associated with Grace, something similar to trying to recreate a recipe without having all the ingredients, trusting that if they repeated the right formula, they would eventually obtain the result they were looking for. According to them, those clones could open the path to Elpis. The organization believed that if it managed to create duplicates related to Grace or to Spencer's original research, it could find the biological key that would supposedly unlock that mind control virus. But the problem was that this entire theory was built on a mistaken interpretation. So, we understand that Grace was not the key. Elpis was not a weapon, and Emily and Marie were not the solutions to the mystery. They were only more victims of a new conspiracy. Marie was identified as Subject 170, Emily as Subject 171, and both were transferred to Road Hill Chronic Care Center, the hospital that Victor Gideon used as a front to continue his research. There they were locked behind glass chambers, separated from the rest of the patients, and constantly monitored. And this is something very important, because although Emily and Marie are similar in origin, their stories end in completely different ways. Marie's path represents the obvious failure of this research. Emily, on the other hand, represents the possibility of salvation, and Grace represents the humanity that the connections tried to turn into a key. Marie's story is particularly tragic because she was subjected to one of the most brutal procedures in the entire project. The researchers extracted small blood samples from 115 infected individuals and injected them directly into her body. At first, the results seemed promising. Her strength increased, her physical resistance grew, and her body began to show an abnormal adaptation to the mutant strain of the T-virus. From the cold perspective of the scientists, that could seem like progress. But when her body stopped responding the way the researchers wanted, she was classified as a failure and scheduled to be eliminated. But before they could dispose of her, Marie escaped. Using the strength that the experiment itself had given her, she opened a hole in her cell and fled into the hospital basement. There, far from the cameras, far from the doctors, and far from any possibility of help, the virus fully took over her body. And from that transformation, the girl was born. One of the most terrifying creatures in the game. Her body deformed until she became a pale and enormous creature, with long limbs and unnatural movements. Her jaw became distorted, leaving her teeth exposed. Her skin turned pale and highly sensitive to light. Her eyes became swollen, her feet became digitigrade, and her body grew in a disproportionate way. But the most interesting thing is that Marie did not completely lose everything she once was, because the mutant strain of the T-virus preserves fragments of memory, habits, and emotional traits in its hosts. In zombies, this manifests through routines, such as a maid who keeps cleaning, a cook who keeps cutting meat, or doctors who repeat procedures and diagnoses. But with Marie, something more painful happens. She preserves emotional remnants and fragmented memories, as well as a connection to her previous life with Emily. That is why, even though the girl is brutal, cannibalistic, and extremely aggressive, there is still something of Marie inside her. And this is especially clear in her relationship with Emily. Because when Marie finds Emily, she does not kill her. She recognizes her. Not in a rational way, not like a normal person who understands what she is doing, but like a creature that still preserves an emotional fragment of attachment. That is why she spares her. That is why she takes her to an underground cell filled with dolls. That detail is important because it shows that inside that creature, there is still a girl, confused and trapped in a form she can no longer control. Marie is a terrifying creature, yes, but she is also one of the most tragic victims in the game. Her weakness to light also reinforces that idea. That is why she lives in the basement, using shadows, tunnels, and enclosed spaces to move around. Because the light does not only damage her physically, it also works symbolically. It is as if the outside world, The world where she was never able to live as a normal girl had now become something incompatible with her own existence. That is why her ending is so sad. When Grace manages to open a hatch in the ceiling and light floods the area, Marie's body cannot withstand it. The creature falls apart, and with her, what little remained of a girl who never had a real chance disappears. Emily, on the other hand, has a different fate. She was also created by the connections. She was also locked away. She was also treated as an experimental subject and not as a person. But her story takes another path. Emily was kept in isolation as Subject 171. During one of the procedures, she developed severe cataracts and lost her sight. To keep her mentally stimulated during her confinement, the staff taught her Braille, something that later becomes important during the story because it allows her to help Grace. The hospital files describe her as an unsettling girl with almost no visible emotions. A nurse even feels uneasy taking care of her because Emily does not respond normally to human contact. But of course, here we have to understand that Emily had not lived like a normal girl. She had not had a family, freedom, or a real childhood. Her apparent coldness does not mean she is evil. It means she was raised in isolation. That is why she does not know how to react to contact, because no one had ever shown it to her before. During the outbreak at the care center, her glass chamber protects her from the first wave of infection. While outside, the patients are devoured, the doctors transformed, and the hospital becomes a nightmare, Emily remains locked away, listening as everything around her collapses without being able to see it or fully understand it. And then Grace finds her. This encounter is key because Grace begins to become something Emily never had, a protective figure. Grace treats her like a girl, like someone who deserves to escape, like someone who deserves to live. That is one of the most important differences between Grace and the other characters involved in the project. The connections see Emily and Marie as tools. Victor Gideon sees them as means to reach Elpis. Spencer would have seen them as pieces within his research, but Grace sees them as people, and that difference changes their fate. Emily accompanies Grace during her escape. Although she is vulnerable, blind, and does not fully understand the horror surrounding her, she does prove that she is not useless. Her knowledge of Braille helps solve the final puzzle needed to leave the hospital. However, Emily is temporarily captured by Marie and rescued by Grace, becomes involved in the attempt to escape the hospital, and is eventually gravely injured after the helicopter crash. Grace tries to save her, taking her to a safe place. She tries to revive her when she stops breathing, but just when it seems she has managed to bring her back, Emily's body succumbs to the mutant T-virus infection, and then Emily mutates. Her transformation, however, is different from Marie's, because Marie mutated after an extreme, prolonged, and brutal exposure. Her body had time to deform and partially adapt. Emily, on the other hand, suffers a more sudden and violent mutation. Her body becomes covered in tumors, her face deforms, her mouth becomes vertical and opens in a monstrous way, and the infection takes control of her in a matter of seconds. Grace tries to calm her down, but it is already too late. And then Leon appears, shooting Emily, but not killing her. And that detail is key, because in that moment, Grace believes she is witnessing the definitive death of the girl she was trying to protect. But Leon, with his experience and precision, manages to neutralize her without damaging her vital organs. Later, when Elpis is finally recovered, Emily is treated with the antiviral, and her mutation is reversed. Her body stabilizes. She even regains the sight she had lost because of the experiments. And for the first time in her life, Emily stops being an experiment and becomes a girl with a second chance. But that moment also leaves a very sad question in the air. If Emily could be saved thanks to Elpis, could Marie have been saved too? And that doubt makes her story even more painful, because perhaps Marie was not an impossible creature to save from the beginning. Perhaps she simply went too far. Perhaps her body, her mind, and her memories were already too destroyed when the light finally ended her. That is why the differences between Grace, Emily, and Marie are so important to the lore of Resident Evil Requiem. All three are connected by a lie. Grace was pursued because they believed she was the key. Emily was created because they were trying to copy that supposed key, and Marie was destroyed because they tried to force that answer inside her body. But the truth was much simpler and much crueler. None of them was the solution the connections were looking for. The entire project was born from a mistaken interpretation of Spencer's files. A cure was mistaken for a weapon, a normal young woman was turned into the center of a conspiracy, and girls like Khloe, Emily, and Marie ended up paying the price. That is why, to understand the creatures of this new Resident Evil, it is not enough to talk about their mutations, teeth, claws, tumors, or abilities. First, we have to talk about their history and identity. Because before Road Hill Chronic Care Center was filled with zombies, there was already something much worse present in its laboratories. The idea that human life could be copied, used, and discarded as if it meant nothing. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.